The Cessation Corps Procedural Manual, Volume 3, Acquisition Protocols, Subsection 7, Ceremony Conduct in Contested Environments, contained, across its 412 pages, exactly one passage that Veth Kalan had ever found genuinely useful in a crisis. It read, "The ceremony master is the living embodiment of the Covenant's commitment to civilized transition. His bearing, his precision, and his absolute procedural confidence are, in themselves, instruments of the ceremony's purpose." He had written that passage himself 30 years ago during the third edition revision. He was thinking about it now because the human was eating, not aggressively, not performatively, simply and quietly eating a compact foil-wrapped rectangle, a protein bar. Xerath had murmured helpfully when Veth Kalan's three eyes fixed on it, with the focused attention of someone who had decided to eat and was eating. He had looked up when the delegation arrived. He had assessed the full formal party, Veth Kalan in his charcoal ceremony robes, the two attendants of record in flanking position, Translation Officer Reen at readiness, Xerath at his customary left shoulder, the security detail at a discreet distance, with the same calibrating look Veth Kalan had seen in soldiers across 11 acquisitions. Then he had asked his question about 4 people, received his answer, nodded, and returned to the protein bar. Veth Kalan was the living embodiment of the Covenant's commitment to civilized transition. He waited for this to feel useful. "Corporal Adeyemi," he said, after a moment that was approximately 1 moment too long. "I am Veth Kalan, Ceremony Master, First Rank, in service of the Covenant of Aligned Worlds, charged with the formal administration of the cessation of hostilities as ratified by the Covenant's 7th Acquisition Council." He had delivered this title precisely 42 times. It had, in 42 prior instances, produced a response: shock, grief, resentment, relief, once a very long philosophical speech that he had patiently received in its entirety. "I am here to conduct the formal ceremony of cessation for this world's acquisition. I believe you are the senior surviving military representative in this sector." Yusuf Adeyemi looked up from the protein bar. He was young, 24, the survey report had said, and the number was difficult to reconcile with the face, which had the specific quality of tiredness that aged things while leaving their essential character intact. He was wearing the remnants of a military uniform that had experienced the campaign without a great deal of logistical support. Beside him on the rubble, resting with careful informality against a broken section of wall, was a weapon that Veth Kalan's security detail had noted, and quietly not acted on, because the human had not moved toward it, and there was a working understanding in the security corps that beings who were going to use their weapons were generally doing so already. "Meta Senior," Yusuf said. "Sergeant Priya Mehta. She'd be the one for something official." He broke off a piece of the protein bar, honey oat, Sarath had identified. In the very small voice Sarath used when relaying information he was uncertain how to contextualize, and ate it. "She went out on patrol this morning. Should be back by now." A pause. "Have you seen them?" 4 people. "We have not," Veth Kalan said. Yusuf nodded. He looked at the horizon, the western approach, a rubble field that had been something else, 8 months ago. For a moment it had a particular quality Veth Kalan could not immediately classify. Then he looked back at the protein bar. "Okay," he said, "I'll wait." Veth Kalan's sound organs opened, fully, involuntarily, in a way he found professionally embarrassing. Beside him, he heard Sarah's stylus pause on the record tablet. He closed them. "Corporal," he said, with the measured patience of someone who had navigated 42 of these proceedings and was accessing 60 years of professional resource. "Perhaps I should explain the nature of the ceremony." He explained it well. He always explained it well. The cessation ceremony, he told Yusuf, was not a mechanism of defeat but a mechanism of acknowledgement, an institutionalized recognition that a state of hostilities had concluded and a new administrative arrangement was in effect. The Covenant did not require the ceremony as a legal precondition. The acquisition was legally complete regardless. The ceremony existed for the defeated world's benefit, to provide formal structure to a transition that was otherwise structurally formless, to give the surviving representatives of a civilization the opportunity to participate meaningfully on the record in the acknowledged conclusion of their world's independent governance. This was, Kalan said, and meant it, the most dignified option available in an inherently undignified situation. Yusuf listened to all of this with his full attention. Kalan had addressed beings who stared at the middle distance, beings who wept, beings who had to be restrained from physical action, beings who had prepared speeches. Yusuf Adaimi listened the way someone listens when they are genuinely interested in the information being provided. And when he asked questions, they were reasonable questions. "How long does it take?" he said. "Approximately 2 hours, depending on the number of designated representatives. And the senior military officer is the right person. In the absence of, she'd know more than I would. Priya would want to do it." He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the western approach again. "She should be back." "Corporal," Kalan said carefully. "Where is Sergeant Mehta?" "On patrol," Yusuf said. The two words were factually accurate. They were delivered with the specific flatness of someone who had decided on the register in which they were going to discuss a topic and had placed that decision somewhere inaccessible for the duration. Kalan had heard this register before. He had heard it in 100 variations and 42 ceremonies from beings who had lost more than any being should have to process, and had resolved to process it later, somewhere private, in conditions of their own choosing. Something in his posture shifted, a settling of his heavy frame, barely perceptible, the weight dropping almost imperceptibly downward. He became aware of it and straightened, deliberately. He did not always catch this in time. He caught it today. "The ceremony can be deferred," he said, "if there are documented circumstances preventing the attendance of the designated representative." Yusuf looked at him. "I'm not asking you to defer it," he said, with the same reasonable attention he had been deploying throughout. "I'm saying I'm not the right person for it. I said I'd hold the position. I'm holding the position." He picked up the protein bar. "When Priya gets back, she'll do whatever needs doing." There was a silence that Kalan spent trying to locate the procedural response to this statement and failing to locate it. "Corporal," he said, "the acquisition of this world is complete. The formal cessation of hostilities is." "I heard you," Yusuf said without impatience. "That makes sense for the Covenant. You've concluded the campaign, you need to close the record." He broke off another piece of the bar. "But my orders were to hold this position until the squad returns. Nobody with the rank to change those orders has changed them." A pause. He looked at Kalan with something that was not quite a challenge and was entirely serious. "Sir," he added, which was not sarcasm. It was just how he talked to people who outranked him, apparently, including representatives of the military force that had spent 11 months dismantling his world's infrastructure. Kalan's sound organs made a very small, involuntary movement that he suppressed. Sareth made a very small note in the record, which Kalan did not look at. He went to consult with Sareth. This was not in the procedural manual. Ceremony masters do not interrupt a formal approach to confer with administrative staff, but the procedural manual had, as a document, ceased to feel fully applicable to the current situation, and Kalan was 60 years into a career that had given him the seniority to make this kind of judgment. "What does the manual say?" he asked in a voice pitched for Sareth only. Sareth, who had been with him for 20 years and who had, in those 20 years, developed the specific useful quality of a person who gives you accurate information in the tone that allows you to receive it, said, "I've reviewed the relevant sections, sir. The manual doesn't cover this scenario." Kalan waited. "The closest applicable section," Sareth said, "is deferred proceedings, subsection 4. Participating party unavailable, which applies when the designated representative cannot attend due to documented incapacitation or communication failure." "Is that what this is?" Sareth considered this with the precision of someone who was paid to be precise and occasionally could not avoid being honest. "I don't think the protocol writers had this scenario in mind," he said. "No, sir." Kalan looked back at Yusuf, who had finished the protein bar and was now doing something with a small worn object from his jacket. Folded, Kalan thought many times. The papers soft with repetition. He was not looking at the delegation. 42 ceremonies? Kalan said. "Yes, sir." A pause. Behind them, the attendants of record stood in their flanking positions with the practiced stillness of people who are accustomed to waiting and who are beginning to wait in the way that people wait when they are no longer certain what they are waiting for. None of them were like this, Beth Kalan said. No, sir, Sareth said. He said it in the tone of someone who had watched 42 ceremonies and was watching the 43rd, and who understood that they were not the same category of thing. No, they weren't. The pause that followed was the longest in the scene. Somewhere to the west, in the rubble of what had been an urban sector, nothing moved. He went back to Yusuf. "What is that?" he said, nodding toward the folded object. It was not a procedural question. He was genuinely asking. Yusuf looked at him for a moment, the same assessing look from the arrival, recalibrated for a different context. Then he opened the photograph. 5 people in military fatigues, trees behind them, sunlight, all of them squinting into it. That universal human adjustment to brightness, which Veth Kalan had documented across 11 acquisitions and which always looked, to him, like an expression of determined optimism. Yusuf pointed to each one. Meta. A woman, tall, dark hair, the bearing of someone who had been in charge long enough that it had become physical. Takebe. A young man, laughing at something outside the frame, his whole face in it. Reyes. Quiet, slight, the careful stillness of someone who only moved when he meant to. Kowalczyk. The youngest face, Veth Kalam thought, or what he was beginning to understand as youngest, which, in a human 21 years old, meant something different than it would have meant to him at 21, meant that this being had never known a world that wasn't at war. "And that's me," Yusuf said, indicating the figure on the left, half in frame, in the act of getting into position when the picture was taken. His face turned toward the others and laughing at something, not at the camera. "I was the last one in. Deo. Achebe." He always did the count wrong. Beth Kalan looked at the photograph for a moment. He said, "When was this taken?" 4 months ago. We had an afternoon." A pause. "There's a riverbed, about 3 kilometers east. The water was still. You could see it from the rise. Priya said we shouldn't go that far out. But then she came anyway." Something in Yusuf's voice did something at this. A very small modulation he did not seem to notice making. Deo had a camera. Old kind, actual film. He kept saying he was going to develop it. "They trusted you to be here," Veth Kalan said. Yusuf looked at him. The look was not complicated. It was the look of someone hearing a thing that is true and simple and doesn't require elaboration. "Yeah," he said. "I wasn't going to not be." Said the way you say a thing that barely needed saying. All 3 of Veth Kalan's eyes converged simultaneously. The full focus convergence he used only in the ceremony itself. The biological high-attention state that was not in his control now. That was simply happening. The banding at his jaw deepened. The horizontal striations darkening at their edges, in the way they did when he was feeling something he had not given permission to feel. He said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, it was very slowly. "Corporal, the prole, how long have they been out?" A silence. "Since Cyril 4-0er," Yusuf said. Veth Kalan said nothing. "They do long patrols," Yusuf said, in the same flat register as before, which was not a lie and was not the truth and was the register of someone maintaining a compartment that they were not opening yet because there was still a job to be done. "Priya runs long." "Yes," Veth Kalan said, and then said nothing else, because there was nothing else that was his to say. He sat down. Later, in the account, Sareth would write in the ceremonial record, "Ceremony master engaged in extended contextual assessment." This moment would appear in language that was technically defensible and entirely wrong about what was happening. What was happening was that Veth Kalan, after 60 years of professional practice during which he had stood at every ceremony in the full formal posture the cessation corps required, sat down on a piece of rubble in a destroyed urban sector on a conquered planet in his charcoal ceremony robes and did not move to stand back up. His attendants of record exchanged a look that they both denied later. For a while they did not talk about the ceremony. It was Yusuf who moved the conversation, with the same practical directness he deployed on everything, asking, had Veth Kalan done this long? 42 prior, Veth Kalan said. And before that? Administrative jurist, 20 years. Yusuf nodded. He asked, what was the first one like? The first one, Veth Kalan said after a pause that surprised him, was the Velhari. 60 years ago, a species. arboreal, communicative, deeply territorial, with a complex network of relationship obligations that had made the integration process a substantial administrative undertaking. The ceremony had not been simple. The Valhari senior delegate had arrived and said almost nothing through the entire proceeding, and Veth Kalan, 40 years old and in his first ceremony, had understood after the fact that the silence was not refusal. It was grief at a scale that had run out of language. He had filed the complete ceremony record and had thought about that silence, on and off, for 60 years. Yusuf was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father's probably in the processing facilities by now." He said it without inflection, factual, the way he said most things. Northern sector, most likely. He teaches mathematics at a secondary school. They would have needed people to keep schools running, for the integration. He'd find a way to be useful. Processing facilities, Beth Kalan said, because that was the terminology. Yusuf said, processing facilities. He repeated it back without inflection, without heat, just the words in his own voice. And Veth Kalan heard what the words sounded like from the other side of them. Not the words themselves, but the fact of saying them. A man whose father was in a facility, repeating the name of the facility, in the administrative language of the people who built it. Neither of them said anything for a while after that. The light had shifted. Veth Kalan became aware of time in the way he rarely did during ceremony. Not the ceremony's time, which was structured and known, but actual time, moving, irreversible, indifferent to whether the record was filed. It was Yusuf who finally moved. 4 hours. The light was lower, the angle different, the shadow of the collapsed wall stretching east across the rubble. Veth Kalan's ceremonial staff had been standing in formation for 4 hours and had arrived by imperceptible degrees at the specific quality of standing that happened when people were doing it out of practice rather than belief. Yusuf stood up. He turned toward the western approach. He looked at it for a long time, longer than any of the previous looks, which had been assessments, recalibrations, the professional habit of checking. This was not an assessment. He was looking in the way you look at something when you are looking for the last time and you know it, and you are giving it its full due before you stop. Then he sat back down. He was quiet. He sat with the photograph in his hands, folded again along its many lines. He looked at it, or at the folded surface of it, the visible nothing of the outside. He was very still. Then, without looking up, he said, "They're not coming back, are they?" Beth Kalan said, "No." He said it without the procedural softening, the graduated approach, the careful structuring of difficult information, the 30 years of practice at delivering bad news in language that contained it. He said it the way Yusuf had asked it, which was plainly and without the architecture of protection, because Yusuf had asked it plainly and deserved a plain answer and was past the point where anything other than plainness served him. Yusuf nodded. He was quiet. There was a moment, a very brief moment, something that moved across his face and was held there and then not held, and then was contained, that Veth Kalan saw and did not look away from, because looking away from it would have been a failure of witness, and Veth Kalan had, in the last 4 hours, become very committed to not failing this. Then Yusuf said, "Okay." He stood up. He picked up the weapon and slung it correctly across his back. The automatic precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times. The body remembering what the mind was only peripherally involved in. He folded the photograph and put it in his jacket pocket, in the specific place he kept it, without looking. He looked at Veth Kalan. He said, "I held the position." He said it like a report, like a field log entry, a thing that was done, in the past tense, completed, which could now be recorded in the appropriate column. Veth Kalan said, "I know. I need it noted." Yusuf said, not a demand, a practical statement about documentation, from someone who understood that documentation was what made a thing real in the official record. "I'll note it," Veth Kalan said. Yusuf looked at him. "Yeah? Yes." And then, because it was true and he needed Yusuf to know it was true, "I will note it." Yusuf held his gaze for a moment with the assessing quality, and then something in the assessment settled, resolved, like an equation balancing. He nodded once. "Okay," he said, "I'll do your ceremony." The ceremony took 11 minutes. Veth Kalan had conducted ceremonies of 2 hours, ceremonies of 45 minutes. One ceremony of 6 hours occasioned by a translation failure that became the subject of a corps-wide training revision. He had prepared longer ceremonies and shorter ones. He had adapted the formal language to audiences in shock, and audiences in fury, and audiences in the specific hollow stillness of beings who have been through too much to feel anything clearly anymore. He had not prepared a ceremony for one person, on rubble, at the end of a day like this one. He read the formal language of the cessation. His voice had the quality it always had, measured, deliberate, with the specific weight of someone who had said these words 42 times before and believed them, and it also had something different today, a quality he could not have named, which was the quality of a man reading formal words after 4 hours of actual ones. Yusuf listened. When the formal language reached its designated response, the passage that asked the designated representative to acknowledge, in whatever terms were appropriate to their tradition, the formal cessation of the prior authority and the commencement of the transition period, Yusuf said, acknowledged. One word, the correct word, technically, it was within the permissible range of responses. The core manual had always allowed for brevity, and it was also the truest word available to someone who was acknowledging a thing they did not endorse and were not celebrating and were simply, in the absence of any remaining alternative, acknowledging. Beth Kalan accepted it. He performed the covenant's gestures of formal receipt, the precise three-stage movement of the primary hands that he had performed 42 times before, and which meant the same thing now that it had meant then and which felt different now in a way that the meaning did not account for. He said the closing language, done. Sarith was recording in his careful script. Later, when Vethkalan reviewed the record, he would notice what he had noticed in the moment, that the characters were slightly larger than Sarith's usual hand, slightly less regular, as if the act of writing it in real time had required a different kind of attention than recording things that had already happened and been processed and settled into the past. That evening, at his desk, Vethkalan opened the cessation report for Earth Acquisition Sector 7. The form was familiar. He had completed 42 of them. They were not difficult forms. The Cessation Corps had refined them over 3 centuries to capture the necessary administrative information in the minimum required fields: date, location, presiding ceremony master, designated representatives, ceremony status, time of completion, ceremony status, complete, deferred, refused. He looked at these 3 options for a long time. Complete was wrong. Complete was when a ceremony happened in the way ceremonies happened, when the form matched the content, when the record captured the event it was describing. Today's record would say a ceremony was completed and a ceremony was completed, and those 2 things were not the same thing. Refused was wrong. Yusuf had not refused. The word refused implied an oppositional act, a turning away, a decision against. Yusuf had not turned away from anything. He had turned toward something, had been turned toward it from the beginning, had remained turned toward it for 4 hours on a piece of rubble, and the ceremony had eventually arrived at the position he was already facing and waited until he was finished. Deferred was not accurate either, but it was less wrong than the others. Deferred meant, this will happen later. The ceremony would not happen later. It had already happened, but deferred was the only option that contained in its meaning any acknowledgement that the standard sequence had not been standard, that something had intervened between the arrival and the completion that the form's designers had not anticipated and could not have named. He selected deferred and watched the inadequacy of it settle into the document like a stain that would not wash out. He moved to the notes field. In 42 reports, he had not used the notes field. The notes field was for exceptions, anomalies, circumstances requiring documentation outside the standard reporting structure. In 42 ceremonies, ceremonies involving species in the full range of their suffering, ceremonies that had required him to adapt, to improvise, to sit with beings in their worst moments and offer them the only dignified option available. In all 42, the ceremony had been enough. The ceremony had been the event. What needed recording was the ceremony, and the ceremony was in the form. Today, the ceremony was not the event. The ceremony was what came after the event. The event was a 24-year-old human soldier sitting on a piece of rubble in the destroyed shell of what had been a city, holding a photograph, waiting for 4 people who were not going to come back, and holding the position anyway. Not for the record, not for the history of it, not for anyone who would ever read a report filed by a Covenant ceremony master in the administrative database of the acquisition of Earth, for 4 people who were not there to see it. Beth-Kalan put his hands on the desk. He thought about what it would mean to leave the notes field blank. It would mean that the form contained everything it needed to contain. It would mean that the day was administrative. It would mean that the gap between what happened and what the form said happened was a gap that he had seen before and would see again and was part of the job. The irreducible gap between a ceremony and the world it was trying to hold. He thought about "I held the position." He thought about "I'll note it." And "yes." And what he had meant when he said that. He typed one sentence in the notes field. He read it back. It was not the kind of sentence that appeared in cessation corps reports. It was not bureaucratic language, and it was not formal language, and it was not the language the notes field was designed for. It was the language available to him when he was not performing anything. He filed the report. He sat in his quarters for a long time afterward, in the dark, not reading, not working. The day sat in his chest in the way certain days sit, not heavy exactly, not light, present in the way the things are present when they have asked something of you that you did not know you had to give, and you gave it anyway. He was old enough to know that this weight was not a problem. It was, if anything, the sign of a day that had happened to him rather than merely in front of him. He thought about the Volari 60 years ago. The delegate's silence, which he had misread at the time and had understood after. The record he had filed, complete, correct, and the silence that lived in it and the gap between the form and what the form was about. He thought about Sarah's handwriting, slightly larger, slightly less certain, like someone writing in the dark. He thought about a photograph, folded along many lines. He did not think, not precisely, about the notes field, because the notes field had been filed and was done, and what was in it was now in the permanent administrative record of the acquisition of Earth, where it would remain for as long as the Covenant kept records, which was, by current projection, several centuries at minimum. He held his position. 6 words and official Thalari administrative script, not enough, and also somehow exactly enough, the way a handful of water is not the river and is completely the river for the moment you hold it. In the dark of his quarters, Beth-Kalan sat very still and did not try to make the day smaller than it was. Outside, across the acquisition, the processing facilities were processing. The integration schedule was proceeding. The Covenant's administrative apparatus was doing what it did, efficiently, humanely, by the standards available. And somewhere in the northern sector, a mathematics teacher was waiting to learn what came next. Somewhere east of Sector 7, there was a riverbed. The water was probably still. You could probably see it from the rise. Beth-Kalan sat with all of this for a long time. Then he picked up the procedural manual, Volume 3, Acquisition Protocols, and opened it to the section on the cessation ceremony, which he had written 30 years ago, which he believed in, which had failed today not because it was wrong, but because it was built for the space between defeat and what comes after. And Yusuf Adeyemi had not been in that space. He had been somewhere the manual had no section for. He did not know what to do about this. He knew that he was going to have to think about it for a long time, and that thinking about it was going to be different from anything he had thought about in 60 years, and that this was not the worst thing that had ever happened to him in a career that had shown him many difficult things. He closed the manual. He did not read. He sat in the dark. Outside, the planet continued its acquisition. Inside, quietly, in the notes field of an administrative report filed at the end of a very long day, something had been recorded that would outlast many things. A sentence that was not a victory and was not a defeat and was not a ceremony and was not a surrender, but which was true and which was witnessed and which now existed in the permanent record of the Covenant of Aligned Worlds. Witnessed by a ceremony master who had spent 60 years making defeat as decent as possible, and who had met today for the first time someone whose dignity was not his to provide. He held his position.